Hello, everybody. Welcome back to the Science Facts and Fallacies podcast, episode 223. My name is Cameron English. I am your host, as always, joined again by Dr. Liza Dunn. We're here to talk about some science. Liza, how are you this wonderful week?
Fine. I'm having a good week. It's beautiful weather out, and we're having a good week.
Excellent. Always glad to hear that. I'm just back from vacation with my family, and I've got that feeling where I'm back in my chair, I'm back in my routine, I'm ready to go back to predictability instead of as fun as vacation is. So let's jump right into these because I'm thrilled to do this podcast again. So, first up, allergic to eggs. Here's how tweaking chicken genes can save kids from anaphylactic shock. Next up, ticks and mosquitoes are bringing Lyme disease and other vectored illnesses to new places across the U.S. And finally, anti-vax presidential candidate RFK Jr. shows early strength against Joe Biden in the polls. So lots of cool stuff to talk about. It's a nice mix of really interesting and innovative science, and then so,
there we go.
Okay, so let's get into these. This is actually really cool. As a parent of a new relatively young child, this is something you deal with, right? Is you don't know right off the bat if your kid is going to be allergic to peanuts or eggs or milk or whatever. And so you have to essentially just expose them to little bits of it over time. So basically their immune system goes, oh, okay, we're fine with this. But for a lot of kids, I think it's it's maybe upwards of 2% of the population of children are at some point in their lives, like early on, are affected by this. So the story we're talking about, this is by Jessica Norris, writing for Medical News Today originally. And she's talking about gene editing in animals. This is really, really cool. But basically all they did, and Liza can explain the technical details a little bit more, but basically they just cut out the gene that encodes this protein that causes egg allergies, or many of them, maybe not all of them. So the idea is you could edit these chickens, and then they'll produce eggs that are safe to eat, or at least foods that contain them once they're processed won't pose as severe a risk as they do today. So there's lots that has to be done. They have to do clinical trials to make sure they're safe. I mean, it's going to be years before this gets to the market, if it ever does. And there's a lot of reasons we could talk about. But what was your take on this story? Maybe if you have anything to add about the science involved here, the approach they used is called talons, which is just the coolest name for any kind of technology. But jump in here. What did you think of this?
Yeah, so this story is actually personally resonates with me because I have a nephew. My family is very close, and I have a nephew who's got very, very bad allergies. And I actually was there when he had an episode of anaphylaxis. So very frightening for people, very frightening for moms, especially if you're in a situation and you don't know what he's allergic to or anything like that. So when I hear about possible ways of mitigating allergy and severe allergy in children, I think this is kind of cool science, right? Because severe allergy represents the overactive part of your immune system reacting to a protein and making you have terrible symptoms like your blood pressure drops, you can get constriction of your airways, and so you can have trouble breathing. And so you really need to intervene quite quickly when allergy like that develops. So when I hear about things like this, you think about kids who have peanut allergies or kids who have egg allergies, and these allergies actually happen frequently with foods that are actually really an important part of a diet. So if you think about it, meat, milk, and eggs are critical for children's brain development because they are a very protein-rich source of nutrients. And so if you can have kids have more access to these things, I think it's better for their overall health. So if you cut out those things, so if you have a dairy allergy and an egg allergy, all of a sudden you've got two really fundamental food groups that are not accessible to kids. And so if you can actually think of a creative way to minimize the exposure of those children to those proteins, you can offer them better nutrition or more easily accessible proteins than you do with just meat alone, right? Or we know that vegan diets, for example, are often very, very low in protein. And so that's something that we have to be very careful about when we're putting kids on those diets. So with allergy, once again, you're making an overactive immune response to a protein in your food. And so what these people did was they used a kind of like a find sequence. So you've got your genes, and your genes are kind of, if you think about it, recipes for proteins. If you think of your DNA as a cookbook, and the cookbook is full of recipes for different proteins, and those proteins are the building blocks for your body. Now, sometimes genes can code for proteins that in let's say animals that can cause problems in people, or even in plants that can cause problems in people, right? And those problems may be toxicity or allergy. And so what we can do, what these researchers have done, is they've found the recipe for the gene that makes the recipe for the protein that causes allergy in eggs, or the major allergen in eggs. And they've just edited it out. They've said, find it, cut it out, and then you get normal chickens that will make eggs that won't make that protein. So it's upstream of the actual egg itself. And so you can have essentially a genetic a chicken with the gene kind of removed, and so they can make eggs for the rest of their lives that you could even label as this is good, safe for kids with allergies. Now this is we're all still in the kind of designing part of this, but it really I think represents wonderful science and is really exciting for kids who have allergies, who can't eat regular foods a lot because cookies, everything has eggs and butter in it, cookies, cakes, things that kids like to enjoy. And so my poor nephew comes to parties often and won't be able to have the same things that so many of his other friends have because of these allergies. So I think that's what this represents. Wonderful science, but it also represents a really good opportunity for kids.
She addresses this in the story. She points out, much like you just did, that it sounds simple. Well, just avoid eggs, right? But of course, eggs are in not everything, but they're in quite a few, like baked goods, all kinds of processed foods, and so you have to read labels very carefully. And you have to be very vigilant. That's the word that they used to describe this. That sounds very frustrating to me because, as someone, fortunately, I've been blessed with no food allergies, which is great. But I go into my kitchen or I go to a restaurant, I don't think twice about, is there peanut fragments or, peanut dust in there? It doesn't occur to me. I just eat. But if you had to live your life going, okay, does this restaurant cook this with eggs, or can I have pancakes? Did they cook eggs next? Like those kind of questions don't occur to me. So all that to say, if this does come to market at some point, this is an enormous, way to improve the quality of life for people.
That's exactly right. And now the other thing is that many kids also do grow out of these allergies eventually. And so my nephew has grown out of some of his allergies, but it does represent still a really concerning area for them. They get worried about what they can and can't eat and things like that. Now, the caveat that you just kind of have to think about along these lines with this is you can also genetically modify peanuts to decrease peanut allergies, right? And the problem is that if you don't have some way of differentiating those products, the gene edited or the genetically modified product, you could actually get someone thinking that they're going to eat something that is safe that's not for them. So that's one of the kind of things that we're going to have to kind of navigate around and make sure that there is some kind of way of alerting people with true anaphylactic allergy that this product has this particular gene taken out, and therefore they won't have that protein in their diet. So there are nuances to this, but overall, it's really exciting.
Yeah, it sounds like that might be one case where food labeling makes a great deal of sense. where,
Yeah.
and I mean, you can see this, right? Like you can see when you go to a restaurant, it'll say, things here are prepared and they might have, certain ingredients in them, heads up. It sounds like this would have to be much more thorough and more careful, because you can't just say, hey, this is fine. And then,
Yeah, that's accurate.
Anyways, really cool stuff. I'm curious to see what happens with this. They mentioned in the article, it has to go through clinical trials. So those take years, unless it's the middle of a pandemic, but otherwise they're gonna have to spend a lot of time. Can you speak to that at all? Like, obviously they're gonna do trials with humans at some point, but what would be the next, like if you wanted to demonstrate the safety of this, what would be the next step in the process? Do you have any insight there?
Yeah, so it's really interesting. We actually wrote a paper. There are not a lot of studies that actually go, especially for food, right, that go all the way from the very, very beginning for example, when you decide that you want to make a genetically modified crop, right, a plant with a feature in it that confers some kind of benefit, right? So you have to figure out which protein you want that plant to make. And you have to compare that protein with all of the other known proteins that are out there that cause allergy and that cause toxicity, to make sure that there's not an overlap from the beginning. So all the way in the beginning, they will go and look at a bank of, they'll look at a database, looking at all the known allergens, how they're structured, where their sources from, right? And they will characterize that protein in great detail before they'll ever introduce it into the plant or the whatever they're modifying, in order to prevent the actual development of allergy, right? So they'll look at they'll look at it at a database. They'll characterize the structure of it. They will do toxicity testing of the protein itself on animals to make sure animals don't have any kind of response. And they will insert that DNA into the DNA that is the recipe for the gene, the DNA that's a gene, that's a recipe for that protein, into testing plants. And then they will make sure that that plant is not terribly different than its ordinary counterparts without that little segment of DNA. And they will do extensive allergy and toxicity testing in animals and things like that. This takes a very, very long time to do. So, years, hundreds of millions of dollars worth of research, and to demonstrate that it is equivalent to its conventional counterpart. And then, but we actually then went on to actually do a study where we looked at whether or not certain proteins we were thinking about were potentially caused any allergy in people. And so we did allergy testing with those protein sources on our paper, to demonstrate that this is a possible way of evaluating that. And it was a pilot study. But we took it all the way from the in silico or database and structure part all the way into the clinic to see if this was a feasible way of doing testing. Regardless, these are all, for GMOs have been eaten by billions of animals and hundreds of millions, if not billions of people. And we know that they don't cause harm.
We need more studies, Liza. We need more.
I know, right?
There hasn't been enough. I read it on the internet.
Yeah.
There's something like, I forget the statistic now. It's somewhere between like 2,000 and 3,000 different papers have been done just characterizing the various aspects of plant genetic engineering. So anytime I see that claim now, I go, what do you?
How many more? Right.
Yeah.
But each protein that's used has been extensively studied from like the very, very beginning, the way where it comes from and what it looks like, and does it have any known counterparts that are cause of allergies or toxicity? So it's no other crop is tested that way, right?
Yeah. So it's really cool. I think this, if and when this does get approved, media like this podcast will be useful, because what we're basically saying is this takes forever. And they look at everything, like every single aspect of this, right down to like how much of a particular vitamin or a particular nutrient a food produces relative to what you can already buy in the grocery. Like, so in other words, as long as we're transparent about that and people have access to the information they need, I think this will help quell any concern that our friends in the organic movement. Yeah.
And these scientists want to solve a problem that is really, really difficult for children and a life-threatening problem for children. And this is a really creative way to do that. So, that's the motivation, how to address this problem for kids so they can have access to the healthiest and best diet that they can have.
I just love this. I love this. It's cool. This is what attracted me to this as a science writer. Why I started covering this is that there's just so many practical problems you can address by modifying the genes of the food we eat, or animals. And it's cool. And
we've been doing that by trial and error for since the beginning of agriculture, right? These plants seem to be disease resistant. These plants seem to, be drought resistant. Let's put one together with the other one and see what happens, right?
Yeah.
So we've been doing that since the beginning of time. We just now actually know how all that works. It's so granularly that you can really do things efficiently and well.
It's incredible stuff. And on a related note, I suppose, is this story from the Wall Street Journal about mosquito-borne illnesses. So this is called "Ticks and Mosquitoes Are Bringing Lyme Disease and Other Vectored Illnesses to New Places Across the U.S." This is by Emma Brown and a handful of other contributors to the Wall Street Journal. And they're talking about, and I have to say from the, I'll hold off. Let me just summarize the story before I start opining about what's going on in here. So they're saying that changes in land use, climate changes are making it easier for mosquitoes to spread to new parts of the U.S. and to vector diseases that have been here before, but they're relatively uncommon. When you think of malaria, you think of sub-Saharan Africa. You don't really think of, I don't know, Mississippi.
South.
Right.
Right.
Right. You don't think of that. But they're talking about these land use changes, climate changes. They're talking about regrowing forests in North America, the northern part of North America, if you will. These are increasing the population of deer, I think they said, and deer carry these mosquitoes around. And then, of course, you have globalization. You have international travel. Go. Did you want to jump in there?
No, I said ticks. The deer are carrying ticks.
Yes, thank you. See, this is why you do a show with the doctor. So, and all that to say, and there's very few numbers in the story. That's one thing we can get into. But basically, the point is, and it's a short story. It's just to say, look, there's this is a concern, and there you have it. So, give me your take on this, and then let's try to supply some data here, because they didn't provide any of that. So go ahead.
So in terms of there are a lot of diseases that ticks and mosquitoes carry, but there are three really genera of mosquitoes that carry disease. So those are Aedes, Culex, and Anopheles. Anopheles really is the mosquito that carries malaria, and malaria has a devastating impact on a huge proportion of the world, all over South Asia, all over Africa. In tropical climates, you wind up with this type of mosquito that has a huge more impact on morbidity and mortality worldwide with malaria. It's interesting. You can tell just by looking at the mosquito which mosquito is an Anopheles mosquito. And that's because the Aedes and Culex mosquitoes, when they're feeding, they feed like at a 90, their proboscis goes in at a 90-degree angle, but the Anopheles are at like a 45-degree angle. So
interesting.
If they have their little bottoms up in the air, that is a malaria-carrying mosquito, or the type of mosquito that carries malaria. But so malaria, though, you can treat. It's got you've got a variety of anti-malarials that you can use to combat it, right? And then Aedes mosquitoes are invasive, and Aedes mosquitoes showed up in Texas in the United States in the 1980s in some used tires. Their eggs are really, really hardy, and they tend to survive a lot of adverse climatic conditions. And so they showed up in used tires and have since moved north and have been found as far north as New York and getting even further. And then they also, into Minnesota and places like that. And they also recently found 80s in the EU, and I want to say it's either the Netherlands or Belgium. I think it's the Netherlands. So, and once again, these are invasive mosquitoes that are vectors of viruses that don't have antibiotic treatment. So you have to prevent people from getting those diseases because the treatment for those diseases is largely supportive. Now, so the two kind of things that we've talked about, the two diseases that we've talked about with mosquitoes and ticks, and we'll just concentrate on the mosquitoes for a minute, and then we'll go to the ticks. So Lyme disease is something that we hear a lot about with ticks, and then you hear a lot about West Nile. So West Nile is a disease that usually it's a viral illness. It is in the same family of viruses that yellow fever is, that Zika is. It's a flavivirus is what it's called. And it is vectored by different kinds of mosquitoes. So it's vectored by the Culex mosquitoes and also vectored by Aedes. Culex mosquitoes tend to like to get their blood meals from birds, right? And so West Nile virus is generally a disease that bothers birds. And you will see one of the first kind of things that public health authorities will start paying attention to is if we got large numbers of bird deaths. And for some reason, they tend to really bother crows. You'll see dead crows that get, West Nile makes dead crows, they're very, very prone to getting very sick and dying from that. The other bird that is susceptible to West Nile virus is the robin, tends to be a carrier. So now we say this is a disease that's largely, transmitted from mosquito to birds and back. And that's what the life cycle usually happens in. But every once in a while, you get what we call a dead end host, where you will have a mosquito that has gotten infected with this virus from a bird, and they will bite a person or they will bite a horse. And the person or the horse, a lot of times you'll have the very sort of mild fever or, cough and cold, not feel very good, and that'll be the end of it. You won't make enough virus in the bloodstream or viremia for the mosquito to bite you and transmit it to somebody else. So this life cycle is in birds, but it dead ends with you or a horse. Now, in certain people, including a friend of my father's, West Nile is devastating. So you can wind up with, this man wound up in a coma for a while and then woke up quadriplegic. So it affects the nervous tissue in adults and can wind up causing devastating neurologic illnesses. And so you don't really, even though it's not all that common, you really want to prevent people from getting this because it's a terrible disease for people who get sick. So that's West Nile. Now, the other thing is that Aedes can vector, like I said, several other related viruses like dengue. And with Aedes moving up further north and the climate warming moving up further north, dengue fever can turn into a hemorrhagic virus like Ebola. So you want to be very, very careful about not controlling the mosquitoes that vector these particular viruses. And we're starting to see an emergence of these viruses, an increased incidence of people getting sick with them as we're seeing these, having global change, and they're being introduced. You can introduce viruses and invasive species in all sorts of different ways, but we've got air travel and things like that help contribute to the potential for these things to really get blown out of proportion. So that's the mosquitoes, and those are those viruses. And once again, you actually have to control the mosquito in order to prevent the disease. So the way that you can control mosquitoes is with insecticides like pyrethroids, which are derived from chrysanthemums. They have very little toxicity for humans, and they are really, really critical for preventing kids from getting things like malaria and people from getting, animals from getting heartworm and other things that mosquitoes carry. So there are lots of different classes of insecticides that are very, very protective, and we've forgotten what it's like to live with malaria and these other diseases. I mean, we eradicated malaria in the United States and Europe, by spraying DDT. So we don't see it that often, and we've forgotten how important that is. Now, in terms of ticks, you hear about Lyme disease a lot. And, Lyme disease is a bacterium that's found in the tick. And so the ticks will have a blood meal also from deer. They'll fall off the deer, and often they'll be in there. So the baby ticks are called larvae. And then they have another stage that's their nymphs, and they're teeny tiny. So it's very, very hard to see them. Most people don't even realize they have a tick. It may look like a very small freckle. And then the adult ticks people recognize, but the nymph stage can really be, if it's left on for long enough, can transmit Lyme disease efficiently. But you generally have to have the tick on you for a couple of days for it to inoculate you with enough of this bacterium to cause problems. And this particular bacterium is associated with a rash that looks like a bullseye, and it's called erythema migrans. And that's actually one of the kind of diagnostic clues that somebody's has Lyme disease, right? And that's acute Lyme disease. People who have the chronic form of Lyme disease can wind up having cardiac problems. They can have like funny heart rates and heart rhythms and things like that. They can get neurologic issues like Bell's palsy, so where half their face is paralyzed. So you really want to manage this as well. How do we prevent people from getting tick bites? And I'll contend that ticks carry some very deadly diseases as well, like Rocky Mountain spotted fever. So Lyme disease we hear a lot about, but Rocky Mountain spotted fever is a devastating disease, and it can really kill kids. So once again, protection, an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. And so you really want to make sure you are using insect repellents if you're out in the woods. You do kind of need to think about controlling, the deer population as it explodes. You need to also make sure that you are aware of these diseases and what to do about them. So you can take doxycycline or a variety of other antibiotics to treat the tick-borne illnesses. But you want to just, be smart and use integrated techniques to try to prevent getting these diseases.
Very serious stuff. I don't want to downplay how harmful these can be and how important prevention is. Here are some numbers, though, because maybe this is just my perception, but the journal articles seem to imply that these are unprecedented increases and be very scared. But the data were very spotty. It's like, oh, here in Pennsylvania in 2019, there was an exorbitant increase. And, anytime you're getting that granular with specific statistics, I always go, there's got to be more to this. Indeed, there is. So this is the CDC, just to put it in context. So they say local U.S. mosquito-borne malaria spread has resulted in more than 150 locally acquired, that is in the U.S., 150 locally acquired cases and more than 60 limited outbreaks over the past 50 years. So again, for those people, it's very unfortunate, potentially deadly in some cases.
And the important thing about those people is, since we don't see it here most of the time, they often get delayed diagnoses. Mm-hmm. So they can be very, very sick, and then all of a sudden you're like, oh. So
right, yeah, and I think they mentioned that in the story too. Is that some places, if you're a physician and you don't see something, or ever or rarely in your practice, then you may not know how to treat it or how to identify it even. And so that is a potential problem. With West Nile virus, this is according to the National Park Service, and they're quoting CDC data. They say that there's probably 2,500 or so cases in the US, but they say this only represents 1 to 2% of cases because most infected people don't have symptoms, which very interesting, which adds a whole nother layer to this. So what's going on there? Do people get this and their immune system fights it off and they just...
Yeah, that's precisely what it is. And I think this is kind of very true about a lot of different diseases. You will see a spectrum of responses in people. Now, the people who tend to get sick from West Nile tend to be over 60. That's your demographic that you have to be a little bit more careful with. And so if you and it may be that they're more immunosuppressed, but I suspect that there is what we call a phenotype, somebody who is more prone to a certain disease based on the way they are built, based on their genetics and things like that. So, for example, there is a type, there's meningitis, right? Meningitis comes from a bacterium, and that bacterium is carried in people's noses, right? And if you test a whole bunch of people, you will find that bacterium there. And the vast majority of them won't get sick. They'll be completely asymptomatic. But every once in a while, somebody will come in with florid meningeal sepsis or meningitis itself and die. And so this is a devastating problem for those folks, and they tend to be young and healthy and live in military or college campuses and stuff like that. And all of a sudden, they will be floridly sick, and it's very hard to treat. I suspect that there is something about the way they are built that makes them more susceptible to that kind of disease. You'll also find for things like hepatitis B, some people will get infected, will have a very sort of mild episode, and they just don't feel good, and then they clear it, right? Other people will have a very, very florid response to it, die of fulminant liver failure within a very short time. And then other people are chronic carriers. And so I think it's just all built around the way your particular immune system works. So same thing with these particular viruses. If you've had people who've had maybe previous exposures that were asymptomatic, maybe your immune system's already working against it. Or if you've got people who have never had an exposure and their immune system really kicks in and makes them sick because it's an overactive thing. So it depends on the person.
It's crazy stuff. Crazy stuff.
Yeah.
By the way, it makes me feel less bad when doctors fumble really technical terms occasionally.
Yes, exactly.
I feel less bad. I'm like, I get a medicine from the doctor, like triamcinolone. I'm like, okay. They're hard to pronounce. Everyone has trouble. Okay. Back to prevention for a second. This is really, really important because and that was the reason I brought up those numbers, is that, as severe as these cases can be, there are few of them. And one of the reasons is insecticide. So I'm looking here. This is a study just from March 2023. And they're talking about bed nets that are made, they contain insecticides. And I believe it's pyrethroids they're made with, right? Correct me if I'm wrong.
Yep.
But the study, they point out in sub-Saharan Africa, there are more than 427 million insecticide-treated nets that were distributed just between 2012 and 2014. And in that period, they saw a decline in morbidity and mortality of almost 50%. I mean, that is enormous, right? And all it is you sleep under this net that's treated with an insecticide that just keeps the bugs away, right? Or I don't know if it kills them if they land on it or whatever.
It will, yeah. It'll cause paralysis in the nerves of the insect. It won't bother the kid underneath it. And if you think about the impact that has, in terms of productivity and going to school and things like that, if you're out with malaria and you're having 3 or 4 bouts of that a year, you are not in school. It holds you up, right? You're not able to work productively as an adult. So these things are just hugely, hugely important for productivity, economic well-being, and not to mention health, of course. People are less prone to terrible mortality from malaria with that. And it's meningococcal sepsis. That's the word.
Ooh, okay. Yeah, so you can recover and say it. I still can't. I just fumble it because I don't want to say it. But yeah, all that to say, and I'll link to this study when we publish this episode. But it's indoor spraying. It's these are enormously useful chemicals. Sorry to sound like a cheerleader for pesticides, but
But yeah,
my son does get malaria because of these, and it's great. I want all kids to be able to go to school and not.
exactly.
It's enormously important. Okay. All right. So let's leave that there. Let's move on to our final story here. This is from the Washington Post. This is by a journalist named Michael Schur. And this is interesting, Liza, because this is a great follow-up to the story we discussed a few weeks ago. And I think that was a Post story too, if I'm not mistaken. But the title here is Robert F. Kennedy Jr., and I'm just going to say RFK Jr., so I don't have to say his name every time. But he's title, RFK Jr. tests the conspiratorial appetite of Democrats. And this is from June 5th. And basic thesis here is that Kennedy has widespread support among the Democrats. Seemingly, if you go to these polls, it's 1 in 5 people who are registered Democrats say that they're inclined to vote for this guy. And this is depending on who you are, I suppose this is a good thing or this is a terrible thing. We'll get into that in a minute. And Schur goes on. He says his worldview overall, Kennedy's political philosophy, it seems to be conspiracy. So he talks about the fact that, and we talked about this too, Kennedy will take like an episode from history that was indeed a real conspiracy that really occurred, and then he will mix that with also the MMR shot causes autism, right? So he mixes in these things to give his, what I would say are just crazier ideas, the veneer of plausibility, because he can point to real things that have occurred in the past, even recently, and he can say, look, big so-and-so or big government or big farm, they're lying to you, right? Because here's this real example. And this is interesting, which I want to talk about too, is that he says this RFK is a surprising competitor to Biden. And I don't know if that's surprising based on some of the things we've discussed before, but
I'm not sure that's surprising at all.
Yeah. So basically, but the takeaway here is he has a unified theory of American deception. That's what they call it, right? And the basic idea is there's powerful corporations, there's a powerful federal government, they're conspiring together to make lots of money, and they're doing it at the expense of the middle class. So this is Kennedy's thesis wherever he goes, right? When he talks about vaccines, it's because big pharma and the FDA and the CDC are against you. When he talks about pesticides, it's because big ag and the EPA, right? So this is everything he talks about, in essence, is this sort of conspiratorial-minded thesis that he's pushing. So that's the basis of the article. There isn't much there to say. There seems to be certain implications the author may want you to draw, and we can discuss that. But that's the gist of it, right? Kennedy is a conspiracy theorist, and he has an abnormal amount of support, I guess you could say. So what did you?
He's got a very surprising amount of support. I'm not surprised. He's been able to thread that needle. He's actually pulling people away on the Republican side too. It's because I would contend that there are so many angry people in the country that he actually is able to navigate that. What people are angry about. So you find that there are very many people on the left who are incredibly concerned about the environment, and he is able to, and incidentally, that's where the anti-vaccine movement started, was on the left, with all pro-organic and things. Traditionally, people who were a little less trusting of pharma and medicine and things like that. So he plays into that side with his environmentalist movement, and then he's playing into the anger that has come out of the fiasco of COVID to garner support from now the right. So I actually think he has probably a 20% approval rate in people who are traditionally Republican as well, or more conservative. They may be independents. So I think he is going to be a force to be reckoned with. And unfortunately, he has played on the pseudoscience of vaccines and pesticides. Like I said, I say this almost every episode. We have 5 public health advances of the 20th century that brought us a 30-year increase in life expectancy. And those 5 public health advances are antibiotics, vector control, food security, water sanitation, and vaccines. And he, by using his environmental platform, has promoted a really destructive discussion about agriculture, and is promoting misinformation about agriculture that really puts food security at risk. His stance on pesticides and the environmental impact of pesticides really puts public health and food security at risk as well, by making people so afraid of them and making people think that they aren't studied and they aren't regulated and all of this kind of stuff. And then the impact that he's had on vaccines has been devastating. You look at what happened in Samoa with 85 children die in an outbreak of measles, and vaccine hesitancy because of the way COVID was managed. Vaccine hesitancy has, in general, really blossomed, and it's truly concerning to me that he has played on the fears of both sides and is now forming a coalition of unlikely allies that I think is concerning. I think that in terms of public health, we need to be very careful about what we're envisioning as a better world. I'm really hoping he could have as big, some people talk about the World Economic Forum, and some people say that's a conspiracy, this is that. He feasibly could have the same level of impact because of the policies that he's interested in promoting and the kind of public pressure he's put on companies that actually are really, really important for providing people with products that help them have a healthy healthy lifestyle and abundant food.
Okay, a few thoughts that I want to get out here, and I want your insight on that I found sort of I don't know if amusing is the right word because it's a little more frustrating than that. But one of the things about this article is that they just quote Kennedy at length in certain spots, or they quote people who support him, and then they don't say anything. And the implication, I think, is supposed to be like, what a kook, right? Isn't this guy crazy? But some of the things he complains about are actually legitimate, or at least there are open questions that really,
right.
really serious people have. So, for example, I chuckled as I was reading this. So, speaking of the lab leak origin of COVID-19, which has not been confirmed, it seems to be getting more plausible as time goes on, the more we learn about what the Chinese government was doing at the Wuhan Institute of Virology. But nonetheless,
right.
Discussion for another day. But Schur says, he says, the lab leak origin is a point of disagreement in the government, right? So in other words, they're trying to frame Kennedy as this kook and he's all into these conspiracies. And one of the examples you give is, there's points of disagreement in the federal government. It's like, yeah, but in other words, he can point to high-level intelligence officials and credible scientists and even people who have backtracked on the natural origin or proximal origin, whatever you want to call it, which is funny to me. So this is just a mistake if you're trying to minimize somebody's influence. What are your thoughts?
Well, that's exactly right. And what you're doing is you are assuming that your reader, you're in the echo chamber of your readership, right? So this is what's really frustrating to me is I think that the current mainstream media outlets have gotten so bought by their viewership that they are afraid to maybe entertain questions that their viewership will disagree with. And they won't go, they aren't doing what Twitter actually is doing is it's going into those spaces and having open discussions with people from fundamentally opposed views. And the people who are brave enough to go into those spaces and have these discussions publicly are coming out in the long run. They're being it's actually having a moderating influence. So this has been going on. These Twitter spaces have been going on since November of 2022. So they're relatively new, but they are really providing an opportunity for people with dissenting opinions to have open, honest conversations with each other. And maybe they don't like what the other person is saying, but they're having the conversation. And what's happened at the Washington Post, that kind of question sort of immediately shuts down anybody who has a reasonable question about whether or not there was a lab leak. I mean, okay, it came out of Wuhan. What were they studying in the lab there? They were studying coronavirus. It's at least, whether you believe it or not, it's at least a plausible theory. Whether it makes any difference or not at this point, because the horse is out of the barn, it's still a plausible theory. And you're not a lunatic for saying, I wonder, right? Yeah. So I think that one of the things I'm concerned about is that we talked about this, I think either last week or the week before, but bullying behavior, where you may have all the wonderful scientific information in the world and you may be absolutely right. But if you are condescending to your audience or readers, or can't answer a question to them humbly, or even say, you know what, I don't know, but let me find out and get back to you, you often wind up losing credibility. And it's really, and there is a crisis of credibility in the scientific communications world, and science and just in general. And once again, we don't want to lose the advances that we've made in the 20th century. We're critically dependent on them.
Let me give you just an example of what I'm talking about here with the lab leak thing. I don't want to get derailed. It's just a great example of why people are not taking Kennedy seriously and why it's a problem. So this was in, I believe, 2020. February 2020. This is a Post story. The original headline on this was Tom Cotton, who's an American politician, if people aren't familiar. So the headline is, Tom Cotton keeps repeating a coronavirus conspiracy that was already debunked. So that's February 2020. That's pretty early on, right? And the Post is conclusively saying, this is debunked. A few months later, Science magazine, I believe it was Science, comes out with an editorial and they say, look, this has not been investigated. Science, okay? This is arguably the biggest science journal in the world, biggest science publisher, okay? They come out and they say, the WHO investigations dedicated 4 pages to this. Right, okay, this needs to be investigated. After that, right, the Post comes out and they say, Tom Cotton keeps repeating a coronavirus fringe theory that scientists have disputed, okay? So in other words, you stick your claim on very limited information, you ignore one side of the debate, or maybe there are multiple sides of the debate, you quote the experts that are going to tell you what you want to hear, and then information changes, and all of a sudden you have to go back and go, oh yeah, sorry about that whole debunk thing. We were totally wrong about that, And then fast forward to 3 years later, almost 3 years later, and you have Kennedy, who now has a legitimate example that he can go, look, these people have been lying to you about what's going on at this lab, who's funding it, and who's involved in it. And that's completely legitimate. So
it totally is completely legitimate. And the other thing that is actually quite interesting is the media in leading up to 2016 were debunking this and debunking that and saying there's no possible way that this fringe guy, Donald Trump, is going to win this election. There's no way he's going to win this election. And they did, a similar style. Oh, he's kooky. He did this. He's done ridiculous things. You all need to start taking this seriously, because this guy is showing a lead, a bipartisan lead, in a way that is personally very concerning to me. Now, once again, I don't think that the appropriate avenue for managing my concern about that is to have him not talk, because I believe fundamentally in freedom of speech. But there needs to be a much bigger debate around him and with him publicly. So people from both, and people will say, oh, I'm not going to engage with him, or I'm not going to engage with people who are anti-vaxxers. You're doing that at your own peril. If you don't take what he is saying to be a clear and significant potential threat, and don't engage the audience that he is engaging with, he is pulling people away from the fringes and into the middle. And I think that we have to engage him. We have to be cordial, and we have to have a legitimate scientific debate that we're going to have to figure out how to do this the right way, because the way we did it with Trump was a bad mistake.
There's some indications in the story that people are not going to take that advice, which is unfortunate. So one of the things they point out is that the Democratic Party is not going to host primary debates between Kennedy and Biden. Now, again, the argument for that, which you just outlined, is we're not going to give this guy a platform. Now, that might work if you hold all the cards. If you control media access, then sure, you can just lock someone out if they're saying dangerous things. But you don't have that. Kennedy, as we've said multiple times now, he has widespread support, and he has a lot of venues in the alternative media that have audiences of millions of people. So you're going to try to shut this guy out, and meanwhile, millions of people are hearing what he has to say unopposed. And one thing that concerns me is I've heard political commentators that I follow who have nothing in common with Kennedy. They would adamantly oppose him on a whole host of issues. Mm-hmm. They have nonetheless said, I was never into these conspiracy theories. I was just against vaccine mandates, or I was just against mask mandates or whatever. But now I'm starting to think that, if they're lying to me about that stuff, maybe this Kennedy guy's onto something when he talks about these corrupt, unethical experiments that Tony Fauci was, you know what I mean? So like by trying to shut this guy out, you are giving him credibility, and you're feeding into this. Well, what are they hiding, right? That narrative is going to accelerate now because he's not being given a platform, and you're not forcing the rest of the candidates to argue with him.
That is exactly right. And and once again, don't underestimate him. Just because, academics at universities think that they're smarter than him, doesn't mean, and they can't imagine a world where he could win. Think about he 20% lead, and I think that is not just on the Democratic side. From what I've seen from some Republican data, is the same way. And I'd have to look up the poll to tell you which one it was. But that is a clear and present threat to science and the success of science. And so if you don't want to have a repeat of 2016, if you don't want to have a repeat of 2020, whatever side you fall on, we need to be engaging and in a productive, transparent way. So the general population doesn't feel like it's not getting the answers it needs for really fundamental questions of how this country's going to turn out.
Yeah, and that would be great if someone of like Peter Hotez, like someone of that stature with that expertise would confront him. Now, in a political context, with him being a candidate, maybe that wouldn't be appropriate. I'm not sure, but yeah, you need somebody who can unravel the fallacies that he perpetuates. And if that's done publicly, that's going to shatter the narrative, because he's spun this story about himself. I'm the truth teller. I'm the rebel, right? The establishment doesn't like me. It's a trope at this point, right? After the previous elections we've been through recently. But that is a compelling narrative. But if he gets on stage with someone who says, what you're saying here about this vaccine is just a lie, and here's why it's wrong, right? That will go a long way to shatter the image that a lot of people have of him. And that's how you shut him down, which ultimately I think we all want.
Yeah.
Okay. There's so much more we could say. I don't know if we want to keep going. I think one thing I'll add just as we wrap up here is most politicians, in my experience, are terribly informed about science. To the extent that they do talk about it at all, it's highly partisan. So if their constituents are progressives, they're going to talk about evil pesticide companies. If their constituents are on the right, they're going to talk about the evil FDA. And so everything is politicized, unfortunately, these days. So I think that's another mistake, is they're trying to say, this Kennedy guy is really anti-science. It's like, so is Cory Booker, so is Elizabeth Warren, so is Donald Trump, so is, like even people, and I'm not going to say who, but there are certain politicians I have respect for. And even every once in a while, they'll throw something out there about agriculture. I'm like, come on, dude, really? Anyways. I don't know. I guess we'll just have to see. We'll keep talking about this as the election progresses, and we'll see what happens. But we'll leave it there. We'll be back next week with episode 224, 220. I don't remember. I don't remember what I said at the beginning. 220 something.
There you go.
224. I'm just kidding. This is going to be 224 next week. Okay. Follow us on Twitter at Dr. Liza Dunn, MD, at Cam J English, at Kevin Folto. Give Kevin a follow. He's still active despite being a new dad. At Genetic Literacy for the Genetic Literacy Project. Follow them. They put this whole show on for us. And with that, we'll see you next time. Have a lovely week, everybody.
See you next week. Bye.